Welcome to a journey through one of the most powerful, emotional, and thought-provoking books in all of Scripture, the Book of Job. A book not filled with easy answers, but with honest questions. Not centered around comfort, but around truth. A story so raw and human, yet so divine and eternal. The Book of Job is a timeless narrative, echoing through the ages, across cultures and generations, because it speaks to the deepest cry of the human heart. Why do we suffer? It confronts us with the painful realities of life, unexpected loss, physical agony, relational breakdowns, and spiritual silence. And yet, this is not just a story about pain. It is a story about perseverance, about a man who, despite losing everything, refused to curse God. A man whose name has become synonymous with endurance, integrity, and unshakable trust in the face of unimaginable trials. In our modern world, a world overwhelmed by anxiety, depression, disease, war, injustice, and emotional exhaustion, the Book of Job feels more relevant than ever. We ask, just like Job did, why does a faithful woman face infertility while others abandon their children? Why does a man of prayer lose his job while the corrupt rise higher? Where is justice? Where is God? These are not ancient questions. These are our questions. And the remarkable truth is this: the Bible doesn't silence these questions, it invites them. The Book of Job doesn't give shallow comfort. It doesn't offer a step-by-step manual to escape pain. Instead, it invites us into the tension, into the unknown, where faith is not a formula, but a relationship. It asks us to sit in the ashes with Job, to weep, to wonder, to wrestle, and ultimately to witness how God reveals himself in ways we never imagined. Through this teaching, we'll walk through the heart of Job's journey, from the heights of blessing to the depths of sorrow, from the silence of heaven to the thunder of God's voice, from confusion to clarity, from breakdown to breakthrough, from despair to deeper trust. So I invite you, not just to listen, but to lean in. Lean into the mystery, lean into the questions, lean into the grace that meets us in the dust. Because this book, this ancient story, is not just about Job. It's about you. It's about me. It's about every person who has ever asked, where is God when everything falls apart? So sit back, open your heart, let the noise fade, and prepare to be transformed by the timeless wisdom and fierce compassion woven through the Book of Job. Let's begin our journey into this living, breathing guide, not only to pain, but to purpose, to perseverance, and to unshakable trust in a God who never leaves us in the ashes. Job was a man of integrity. He wasn't perfect, but he was consistent, blameless, upright, a servant of God who turned away from evil, not because it was convenient, but because it was right. He lived with purpose. He lived with reverence. And as a result, Job was blessed, deeply blessed. He had 10 children, 7 sons and 3 daughters, a symbol of legacy and joy. He possessed thousands of animals, oxen, camels, sheep, a sign of immense wealth in his time. He was deeply respected in his community, known not just for his riches, but for his character. In every way, Job was considered favored by God. But then, the unimaginable happened. In a single, brutal, breathless span of time, everything was taken. Messenger after messenger came, each bearing terrible news. First, his oxen and donkeys were stolen. Then, fire from the sky burned up his sheep. Raiders took his camels. And worst of all, a mighty wind struck the house where his children were feasting, and all 10 were killed. Just imagine that moment. The horror, the numbness, the silence. And then, as if grief wasn't enough, Job's health was stripped away too. He was struck with loathsome sores from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. He sat in ashes, scraping his skin with a broken piece of pottery, an image of total ruin. This wasn't a trial. This was devastation. Job wasn't just tested. He was crushed, dismantled, humiliated. He lost his possessions, his children, his health, and his dignity, all without explanation. And yet, what does Job do? He tears his robe. He shaves his head, outward signs of deep mourning. But then, he falls to the ground and worships. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Job 1:21. Let that sink in. This isn't a man in denial. This is a man facing unspeakable pain, yet somehow still recognizing the sovereignty of God. This is faith not in blessing, but in God Himself. Job doesn't pretend the loss didn't happen. He doesn't hide his sorrow. He mourns. He breaks. But he still blesses the name of the Lord. That kind of response doesn't come from religion. It comes from relationship. It comes from a life anchored deeply in the presence of God. But the pain didn't end with material loss. It seeped into his closest relationships. And here, we begin to see the human cost of suffering. His wife, broken by grief, emotionally shattered, could not understand Job's devotion. She cried out, "Curse God and die." These weren't words of hatred. They were the words of a woman who had lost her children, her comfort, and her hope. She was pleading for escape, any escape, even if it meant surrendering to bitterness. And then came the friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. At first, they did something beautiful. They sat in silence with Job for 7 days. They wept with him. They tore their robes. They grieved. But then, when Job opened his mouth to speak, to lament, to cry out, to process the horror, they turned. They couldn't understand how a righteous man could suffer this way. So they assumed he must be guilty. "You must have sinned," they said. God wouldn't punish the innocent. Their theology was neat, but it was cruel. Instead of comforting Job, they accused him. Instead of validating his pain, they minimized it. And isn't that how it often is in our own lives? Sometimes when we're in pain, the people we expect to bring comfort bring condemnation instead. They say things like, "Maybe you didn't pray enough. Maybe there's some hidden sin. Maybe God is trying to teach you a lesson." But Job's story shouts something else. Suffering is not always the result of wrongdoing. Sometimes it's the battleground of the righteous. Sometimes it's the place where faith is refined like gold. Job's story shows us that pain is not just physical. It is relational, emotional, psychological, and spiritual. It affects how we see ourselves, how we relate to others, and how we perceive God. So let me ask you, have you ever been misunderstood in your pain? Have you ever looked around and realized that the ones who should hold you blamed you instead? Have you ever felt abandoned, not just by people, but by God? If so, you're not alone. Job was there too. And through his story, we're reminded that God sees the full picture, even when the world doesn't. Your tears are not wasted. Your silence is not ignored. And your faith, even when it feels like it's hanging by a thread, is precious in the eyes of God. As Job sits in silence, covered in sores, surrounded by ashes and the wreckage of his former life, a deeper struggle begins to emerge. Not just the loss of health, or wealth. Not even the pain of grieving his 10 beloved children, the agony of unanswered questions. And at the center of it all is this question: is God truly just? This isn't an academic inquiry. This is a cry from the depths of a shattered soul. Job, once the embodiment of blessing, now feels forgotten, discarded. He begins to wrestle, not with his circumstances alone, but with the character of God himself. Why me? Why now? What did I do to deserve this? These aren't cries of rebellion. They are cries of relationship. They come from someone who knows God, who has loved God, and who cannot reconcile the suffering with what he believed about divine justice. Job's heart is torn between what he feels and what he believes. He knew God was righteous. He knew he was sovereign. But what he was experiencing felt like injustice. And in this crisis of faith, his friends step in, not to comfort, but to correct. Eliphaz speaks first. He appeals to tradition and experience. Consider, who that was innocent ever perished, Job 4:7. To him, suffering equals punishment. And since Job is suffering greatly, he must have sinned greatly. Bildad follows with even harsher words. If your children have sinned against God, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. Job 8:4. Imagine hearing that as a grieving father. Then Zophar, blunt and cold, says Job actually deserves worse than what he's gotten. Know this: God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. Job 11:6. These friends represent a theology of transaction. Do good, receive blessing. Do evil, receive punishment. It's neat, it's simple, and it's wrong. Because Job hadn't sinned. The very first verse of the book told us so. He was blameless and upright. But that's the danger of rigid, formulaic religion. When things don't fit the pattern, people look for someone to blame, and often they blame the one who's hurting. And Job, he pushes back. With trembling lips and a broken heart, he defends his innocence. He pleads with God for understanding. He mourns not just the loss of his children or his health, but the silence of heaven. I cry to you for help, and you do not answer me. I stand, and you only look at me. Job 30:20. Have you ever been there, in the middle of suffering, not only in pain, but in confusion, when your heart screams, God, where are you? And all you hear is silence. This is where Job lived, not for a moment, but for chapters. His dialogue goes on and on, deep, poetic, raw. He doesn't curse God, but he does wrestle with him. And here's the incredible truth. God does not rebuke Job for his questions. He rebukes the friends. Why? Because Job was honest. He didn't fake piety. He brought his pain, his doubt, his confusion, all of it, to God. That's what real faith looks like. Faith isn't the absence of questions. It's the decision to bring your questions to the one you trust, even when you don't understand him. And isn't that the journey of every believer? We start with confidence. We walk in blessing. And then trials hit. And suddenly we're asking, is God still good? Is God still just? Does he even see me? The book of Job gives us permission to wrestle, to ask, to grieve, to be human. It reminds us that God's justice is bigger than our understanding and sometimes hidden from view. But even in the silence, even in the mystery, God is still present. So, if you've ever questioned God's justice, if you've ever wondered why life seems so unfair, if you've ever felt like your prayers were bouncing off the ceiling, you are not weak, you are not faithless, you are not alone. You are walking in the steps of Job, a man who questioned deeply and yet was still called righteous by God himself. And through that journey, Job teaches us something powerful, that faith is not the absence of doubt. It's the choice to trust, even when the answers haven't come.
And he takes as he wills, yet my soul shall not falter.
After the storm of questions, after the silence of heaven, after the comfortless counsel of friends, one thing remained: Job's faith. Tattered, trembling, but still holding on. This is where the story of Job takes a deeper turn, beyond suffering, beyond theology, beyond debate, into the realm of perseverance and trust. Because the heart of the book of Job isn't just about loss. It's about endurance. It's about a man who refuses to let go of God, even when he can't feel him, see him, or understand him. Job's perseverance isn't polished. It's not pretty. It's messy. It's raw. It's filled with pain, poetry, and protest. But it's real, and that is what makes it powerful. Even when Job doubts, even when he questions, even when he curses the day he was born, he never curses God. He never walks away. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Job 13:15. These are not the words of someone with easy faith. These are the words of someone with tested faith. You see, real trust isn't forged in the sunlight. It's born in the storm. It's in the ashes where true faith is refined, where God becomes more than a concept, more than a sermon. He becomes your only hope. And that's what Job discovers. He begins to realize that faith is not a transaction. It's not a bargain. I obey and you bless. It's a relationship built on trust, not outcomes. Trust says, I don't understand, but I still believe you are good. I don't feel you, but I know you are near. My world has collapsed, but my soul is anchored in you. This kind of trust doesn't come easily. It comes through fire, through seasons where prayers feel unanswered, where dreams die, where the people around you don't understand. And all you have left is God. And it's there, in that sacred, silent place, where God begins to rebuild. In Job chapter 38, after all the debating, all the defending, all the doubts, God speaks, not with an apology, not with an explanation, but with a question. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Job 38:4. God doesn't answer Job's why. He answers with who. He reveals his greatness, his power, his intimate knowledge of every corner of creation. And suddenly, Job's perspective shifts, not because his pain is erased, but because he has encountered the God who holds the universe and still sees him in his suffering. Job replies, My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Job 42:5. This is the transformation, not a change in Job's circumstances, but a change in Job's vision. He moves from knowing about God to knowing God, from distant theology to personal relationship. And isn't that the goal of every trial? Not just to survive it, but to come out closer to God than you were before. Job's story is proof that pain can be a doorway, that suffering can deepen faith instead of destroying it. That trust, real trust, is not built on answers, but on intimacy. It's not about having all the pieces. It's about knowing the one who holds the puzzle. So let me ask you, are you in a season where God feels silent? Are you walking through pain you don't understand? Are you holding on to faith with trembling hands? Then you are not far from the heart of Job. And more importantly, you are not far from the heart of God. Because the power of perseverance is not in pretending to be strong. It's in clinging to God when everything else falls away. And that trust, that quiet, trembling, stubborn trust, it moves heaven. We've walked with Job through his prosperity. We've sat beside him in his suffering. We've heard his cries, his questions, his courage. We've watched as he persevered, trusted, and ultimately encountered God in a way few ever have. But now, the real question is this: what does Job's story mean for you? Because this isn't just ancient history. This isn't just a lesson in theology or patience. This is a mirror, a map for the soul, a message for everyone who has ever asked, why is this happening to me? Let's bring this home into our hearts and into our lives. 1. Finding strength and resilience in hardship. If you're going through a season of loss, heartbreak, or confusion, Job gives you permission to grieve. You don't have to fake a smile. You don't have to pretend you're okay. But Job also shows you that even in your lowest moment, you are not alone, and that God is not absent. Your pain does not disqualify your faith. In fact, pain is often where your deepest faith is born. Job lost everything, but he didn't lose his integrity. He didn't lose his hope. He didn't let go of his God, and neither should you, because storms will come. But you can stand, not because you're strong, but because God is faithful. You are not defined by what you've lost. You are defined by who you belong to. 2. The importance of questioning and seeking. Deeper faith Job's story teaches us something revolutionary. That questioning God is not rebellion. It can be an act of intimacy. God doesn't punish Job for asking why. He honors him for bringing his pain to him, not away from him. Faith doesn't mean having all the answers. Faith means being willing to wrestle with the questions and still trust God with your heart. You are allowed to ask. You are allowed to cry. You are allowed to say, I don't understand. What matters is where you take those questions. Take them to the one who hears, the one who stays, the one who speaks, even when it seems like he's silent. 3. Spiritual growth through suffering. Pain changes us, but how it changes us, that's up to us. For Job, suffering didn't destroy his faith, it deepened it. It took him from religion to revelation. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Maybe you're in a season that feels like ashes. But what if those ashes are the soil where something new is growing? What if this season is not the end, but the beginning of a deeper walk with God? Job shows us that suffering is not meaningless. It can be the furnace where faith is refined, where pride is burned away, where idols fall, where we discover that God is enough. And in the end, God restored Job, not just his wealth, but his soul. He gave him double what he had before. But more importantly, he gave him himself. And that's the treasure of the book of Job. Not that everything was made perfect, but that Job came through it transformed. So, what do we take away? Life will bring trials. Suffering is part of our journey. But the story of Job reminds us, you are seen, you're not forgotten, and your faith, even bruised and battered, is precious to God. God is not looking for perfect people. He's looking for real people, like Job, who will bring him their brokenness, their questions, their tears, and still say, yet will I trust you. So wherever you are in your journey, whether in prosperity or in pain, may Job's story give you courage to stand, to trust, to persevere, and to believe that God is working even when you can't see it. Because in the end, the book of Job isn't just about suffering, it's about redemption, it's about resilience, and most of all, it's about a God who is always worthy of our trust. Amen.